And there are two general types, decision making and iteration, and we will go over both types. So the first one you learn is the if statement. So this is the syntax of the if statement, and in the if statement, if the Boolean expression inside the parentheses is true, the if statement runs and the statements that are inside are executed. However, if it's false, the control passes immediately to the first statement following the if statement. So the if statement is skipped if the expression inside of the parentheses turns out to be false. And for the if else statement, you have an if statement, and then following that you have an else statement. So if the if statement turns out to be false, it moves on to the else and does whatever statement and executes the statements inside of the else. And so the next thing we have is the nested if statement, which is basically an if statement inside of an if statement. So if the first if statement is true, it'll move on to the second one, which is nested inside. And if the second one is true, it will print the statements inside of the second if statement. If the first one is false, it'll skip the whole thing and move on to the next line that follows after. So what we have next is the extended if statement. So here you have an if statement followed by an else if statement, and you could have as many else if statements as you want, and then the last one will be an else. So here you basically have a bunch of different conditions, and whichever condition is met first and turns out to be true, that is the one for which the statements will be executed. So for example, if when we run through this and the grade, let's say the grade is a C, so the first, it goes into the if statement, checks if it's equal to A, and if it's not, it goes to the else if. After that, it'll check if it's equal to B, and since it's a C, it'll go on to the next else if. And here, if it finds that the grade is in fact a C, it will move into this the statement and execute it. And then the entire if extended if statement ends there. It doesn't go on to the next lines. So after that, we have the iteration control structures. So we have the for loop, which, and this is the general form of the for loop, so the syntax. So you have a variable which is initialized here, and you have a termination condition which basically tells the for loop when to stop running, and you have an update statement which either increases the value or decreases or does something to the initial value so that it goes towards the termination condition, and the loop eventually ends after the task is complete. And the next thing we have is the for each loop, which is used to iterate over an array or collection. So basically here, this is the syntax. So you have a type, you have an element of some type, and you have a collection. So it will basically traverse through the entire collection and evaluate whatever statement you have here for every single element inside the collection. So for example, if you have an array here, which is something with a bunch of slots to hold integers or doubles and things like that, it'll run through every single slot and execute the statements for each element inside the array. And note that the for each loop cannot be used for replacing or removing elements as you traverse, and the loop hides the index variable that is used with arrays. So next up you have the while loop, which is the general form, and the general form of the while loop is this. So this loop runs while the Boolean test inside evaluates to true, and the statements in here will function as will be run if this condition is true, and Usually at the end there's something that changes a variable, which leads to the condition eventually turning false so that the while loop stops. And what we have next are nested loops. So basically you could have a for loop inside of a for loop and things like that, which is the same thing as the if statement inside of the if statement before. And so this is also allowed in Java. Next up we have errors and exceptions. So an exception is an error condition that occurs during execution. So for example, if you divide an integer by 0, an arithmetic exception will be thrown. And so an unchecked exception is one where you don't provide code to deal with the error. So if the user inputs something that causes an error, and then it is an unchecked exception. And a checked exception is one where the programmer provides code to handle the exception. For example, it says that if the user inputs 0 and a division by 0 occurs, then do this. So the programmer accounts for the fact that the user may input something that might cause an error using either try, catch, or finally statement, or an explicit throw new exception clause. And these are the errors that are covered in the AP Java subset. So let's move on to the multiple choice. Number 1. Which of the following pairs of declarations will cause an error message? So for the first case, you have double x equals 14.7 and int y equals x. So in the first case, you're trying to put a double value into an integer value, and that will cause an error message because that's not allowed in Java. In the second case, double x equals 14.7 and int y equals int x. And since the x value is casted to an integer, this will truncate the 0.7 from 14.7 and give y the int value of 14. So this case will not cause an error message. And the third case is int x equals 14 and double y equals x. And you're allowed to put an integer value into a double value, so this won't cause an error message either. So this will work, and the only pair of declarations that will cause an error message is the first one, and so the answer to this question is B. Number 2. What output will be produced by this code? So this will first print a backslash because the first backslash tells the code to go into an escape sequence, which then prints this backslash. So right off the bat, we can eliminate A, C, and D because only one backslash is printed. And after that, once the star is printed, it prints this is not. And after this is not, it says backslash n, which tells it to go to a new line. So now we could eliminate B, and the answer to number 2 becomes E. Number 3. Consider the following code segment. If n is of type int and has a value of 0 when the segment is executed, what will happen? So if n equals 0, then the if statement will be rendered false, and statement 1 will fail to run. So it will automatically jump to the else statement and print out statement 2. So the answer to this question is D, because statement 2 is printed but statement 1 is not. Number 4. So for number 4, double answer equals 13/5, and system.out.println prints 13/5 and then answer. So the output to this program is 2.0, but the programmer intends the output to be 2.6. And so he wants to cast the integer value to a double value, and in order to do that, he has to use one of these methods. So A does not work. I mean, A does fix the problem because the 13 gets casted to a double value and it prints out 2.6. And B also works because in case B double is casted, double casts the 5 to a double and it prints out a double value. And in part C, the 0.0 after 13 turns it into a double, which causes the output to be 2.6. And same thing for case D. And then for choice E, the Java first evaluates 13 over 5, which is 2, and then casts it to a double, so it just prints 2.0, which is not what the programmer intends. So the answer to this question will be E. Number 5. What value is stored in result if int result equals 13 minus 3 times 6 divided by 4 mod 3? So for this question, you have to know the order of operations for all of these different operations. So the first thing so multiply, divide, and mod hold the same precedence. So we go left to right and evaluate those first. So we have the 13 minus 3 times 6, which is 18, and then we have divided by 4 mod 3. And from that step we go to 13 minus 18 divided by 4 will be 4 because it will be 4 point something, but the decimal part gets truncated because it only takes the integer, which is 4. And then you have mod 3, and 4 mod 3 is 1, so you have 13 minus 1, which equals 12. So the answer to this question is E. Number 6. Suppose that addition and subtraction had higher precedence than multiplication and division. Then the expression 2 plus 3 times 12 divided by 7 minus 4 plus 8 would evaluate to which of the following? So in this case, we can put parentheses around 2 plus 3 and 7 minus 4 plus 8 because these are the parts that are given precedence. So first we do 2 plus 3, which is 5, and then you have times 12 divided by the sum of these. So 7 minus 4 is 3, plus 8 is 11. And after that you get 5 times, so 12 divided by 11 will be 1 because it only takes the integer part, and 5 times 1 will be 5. So the answer to number 6 will be C. Number 7. Which is true of the following Boolean expression given that x is a variable of type double? So for number 7, we know that the expression is always algebraically true for a non-zero x, but it may evaluate to false because of round-off error when division and multiplication operations are performed, and because there is not a direct casting in this case, and when you plug in 0 for x, that will also cause it to be false. And so the 0 is not the only case when it will evaluate to false. So the answer C can be eliminated. And we know that it won't always evaluate to false. And so in this piece of code can evaluate to false for a few values of x. So B is the correct answer here. Number 8. Let x be a variable of type double